why lessons for quarantine from the letters of Paul? I am going to share with us this evening, I think, 5 lessons that we can get from the letters of Paul that are helpful to this current moment. And I'll summarize them this way. So the first one is social distancing versus distance socializing. The second one is communicating across distance often means miscommunicating across distance. The third one is no hero can save us, but the collective can. Number 4, whose labor are we relying upon? Who are we missing and who is overlooked? And number 5, living in the in-between times. Those might seem a little mysterious for now, but we'll get to all of them before we're done. So first, I want to just briefly say, why the heck am I talking about the letters of Paul here? And I think it's really helpful, this quote from Judith Liu's article, Letters in the Topography of Early Christianity, which I find really helpful. Fundamental to letters of all types, real and fictional, is that they respond to and hence negotiate and seek to overcome actual and imagined spatial and temporal distance between author and recipients. In practice and as cultural symbols, letters, sent and transmitted in new contexts, can be mapped onto the standard epistolary topoi, i.e. type, absent as if present, half a conversation, a mirror of the soul. And again, that's from Judith Liu's article. If anything, this moment is creating distances between us, absences from one another, and we're seeking ways to cross that distance in new ways. And for those of you who are thinking about ministry in this moment, whether that's in a congregation or in a not-for-profit or in a chaplaincy setting, this moment might be about nothing so much as trying to negotiate and seek to overcome spatial and temporal distances without doing harm to one another. We are trying to create intimacy in the midst of absence. And that is what, at their core, letters actually do. So that's why I think it's helpful to turn to the letters of Paul in this time. So this first lesson, lesson number 1, social distancing versus distance socializing. First, I'm going to give a shout out to this really cool thing called the Orbis Project out of Stanford University. Brenda's going to actually post a link to it in the chat for us. If you get bored during my talk, you can just play with this cool website for the rest of the time together. But please do go link out to it and play with it. What it actually does is it lets you map travel time and cost between places in the ancient world. So it's this really great project out of Classics where you can kind of arrange for season, time. It's a little like Oregon Trail for travel in the ancient world. It's a really fun website. And what I think we learn from a website like this and from the work of scholars, and this might seem really obvious, but travel in the ancient world was really difficult. It was dangerous, and it was really time intensive. When you look at a website like Orbis, you can get a rough estimate of how long it would have taken to get from one place to another and how much exactly it would cost, whether by ship or by road. So to take a single example here, I've done a screen capture. Now you might know that it seems like Peter and Paul are bopping back and forth between Jerusalem and Antioch all the time to argue about things in Galatians 2. But bopping back and forth from Antioch to Jerusalem, which is what I've entered here, was a minimum of a week's travel by boat. And that's in the very best season and weather. And it was a minimum 20 days journey by foot. And that's presuming you can walk 30 kilometers or 18 miles a day. And I don't know about you, but I'm currently not able to walk 18 miles a day for 20 days straight. And if you look at this map here, so those little red lines are Antioch to Jerusalem, the sea and land route. Just look way over to the left there, you see Corinth, way across the water there. So you can begin to imagine how far away Corinth might be. And you might only undertake that kind of a sea journey if they're in the right weather and the right season. Now, my colleagues Sarah Griffiths, Kelsey Morrison-Atkins, Karen Connor-McGugan, and Lauren Nasrallah have also recently written about another example we can use to think about travel. There's this tomb from a city named Hierapolis in Asia Minor, and it's got a 1st century CE monument that commemorates a guy who was a merchant. His name was Titus Flavius Zeuxis. And the inscription describes Zeuxis' 72 successful voyages around Cape Malleus, which is an area often known for its shipwrecks. So funerary inscriptions like this one were often crafted to ensure that the dead lived on with honor in the memories of survivors and people passing by. And the one thing this guy, Flavius Zeuxis, decided to highlight about his life was his travel. And it suggests both the difficulty he faced as a traveling merchant and the pride he felt in successfully navigating the sea. And too often we take the ease of travel for granted. Imagine choosing to include a description of your commute on your epitaph. So these letters, before they came to us, once traveled long distances like these. They were dictated and scribed by hand, perhaps rolled up on papyrus, perhaps sealed and carried by a person walking or sailing significant distances to bring the message. So what's this mean for us? In an age of social distancing, we must turn to what I would call distant socializing in order to connect. We can no more take those things which we might have taken for granted. Collective singing, hugs, or handshakes during the passing of the peace, our collective gathering in churches, we can no more take for granted that those things are safe than we can travel from Antioch to Jerusalem in the 1st century faster than in a week. The act of letter writing is at its heart an act of reaching out. And so I'd ask, how can you reach out to create intimacy and absence in this moment? I know many of you are already worshiping remotely or having Bible study on Zoom, but it might also be worth writing a physical letter as well. What I think the most important lesson here is not which medium you use, but rather that you do the act and work of seeking out to reach out and bridge that gap that exists between us right now in order to maintain human connection. How can we think about what it means to do distant socializing in an age of social distancing? So, lesson 2, communicating across distance often means miscommunicating across distance. And here I'd start with by saying that letters of Paul, as I'm sure many of you know, are all occasional letters. They're written for a particular occasion, a particular moment, and to particular people. But one of the challenges of communicating across distance is that it's really hard to express yourself, and people can misread what you intend. Tone doesn't come across well in email or tweet or letter. And sometimes the distance that exists between us can exacerbate conflict, miscommunication, and heightened emotions. And I'm going to read here 2 sets of excerpts from 2 Corinthians, actually in reverse order than you'd usually see them in your Bible. So this first one is some bits from 2 Corinthians chapter 10 to 13. Now, even if I boast a little too much of Paul's authority, which the Lord gave for building you up and not for tearing you down, I will not be ashamed of it. I do not want to seem as though I'm trying to frighten you with my letters, for they say, his letters are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. Let such people understand what we say by letter and absent, we will also do when present. I have been a fool. You forced me to it. Indeed, you should have been the ones commending me, for I am not at all inferior to these super apostles, even though I'm nothing. So I write these things while I'm away from you, so that when I come up, I may not have to be severe in using the authority that the Lord has given me for building up and not for tearing down. And actually earlier in 2 Corinthians is this other passage in chapter 2. So I made up my mind not to make you another painful visit. For if I cause you pain, who is there to make me glad but the one whom I have pained? And I wrote as I did, so that when I came, I might not suffer pain from those who should have made me rejoice. For I'm confident about all of you, that my joy would be the joy of all of you. For I wrote you out of much distress and anguish of heart and with many tears, not to cause you pain, but to let you know the abundant love that I have for you. So why do I read these out of order? Some scholars think that 2 Corinthians actually contains remnants of several letters back and forth that have been smushed together over time. In this reading, this first excerpt, 2 Corinthians 10 to 13, comes from a letter Paul wrote to the Corinthian communities a little earlier. And it's a letter where it's clear from this excerpt that he lost his cool a bit. He complains a bit. He whines a bit. He's threatening a little bit. And of course, by a bit, I mean a lot. This letter clearly didn't go over very well. And so perhaps the rest of 2 Corinthians, including this bit here in 2 Corinthians 2, is a bit of a follow-up letter. And I'm sorry, maybe not so sorry, but I'm sorry. An acknowledgement that when Paul wrote before, he did so in distress and with tears. You know how that feeling is. He sent that tweet late at night after a glass or two of wine while crying and angrily responding to something else he saw on social media that just really set him off. So even if you don't go fully with this scholarly theory, 2 Corinthians, and for that matter, all of Galatians, as occasional letters, record some more human moments of heightened emotion. For our moment, it's worth remembering that we are all living through trauma. We are all experiencing grief. Although some of us are experiencing it in different ways and to greater or lesser degrees than others. Some of us have been ill. Some of us have lost loved ones. Some have lost work. Some are overwhelmed with childcare. Some have to go to work every day in fear for little wages. It's essential that we do reach out to one another across the distance to connect with one another, to be able to process our emotions together. But when we try to communicate with one another in these moments, it's important to acknowledge things will get lost in communication. We will say things wrong. We might need to try again after messing up the first time. It's really difficult to express emotions and feelings well face to face. And it's even more difficult to do so across distance, whether that's that long pause on a phone call or the ... you get on the phone while waiting for that reply to the text. We have to be very careful with one another in this moment. We must try to do better than Paul here, if I may say. And when we get it wrong, we must try again. Imagine for a moment if your very worst email, your least charitable text, your snarkiest tweet became enshrined in Scripture, read for hundreds of generations of Christ followers after you. Write as though your words were sacred, because across distance they are. Lesson 3, no hero can save us, but the collective can. And here I'd like to read a really favorite quote of mine from a chapter by Drew's own Melanie Johnson DeBoffrey and Laura Nasrallah's Beyond the Heroic Paul, toward a feminist and decolonizing approach to the letters of Paul. There is much to gain from reading the letters of Paul in their writing, reception, and afterlives as sites of debate, contestation, and resistance, rather than as articulations of one individual's vision and heroic community-building efforts. By shifting the lens from Paul alone to Paul among others, we gain a better understanding of differences of opinion and perspective, thereby opening debates and productive collaborations both ancient and contemporary, rather than limiting our understanding of the political vision and practices of the Christ assemblies to whatever Paul alone meant or means. Again, we need to remember that the letters of Paul are occasional. They're written to particular people at particular times and places. They're not a big treatise of systematic theology, which is one of the reasons I love them so much. But that means we need to read all of them. We need to include the boring parts, the beginnings and ends of the letters, the dear so-and-sos and the from so-and-sos. We notice then when we do so that Paul is just one of a collection of people who are part of these earliest Christ-following communities. These folks create some of the ideas and terms and models of living together that we follow today, how we do church. And because these letters are one side of a conversation and we're missing the other half, we tend sometimes to give all the good stuff, think all the good stuff comes from this singular genius mind of a single person, i.e. Paul. And that's especially true for Protestants who turn to texts from the letters of Paul for important theological ideas. But these ideas and practices and beliefs are coming up from entire communities, and that becomes clear when we read the whole letters. So if we read the beginnings and ends of these letters, the pre and postscripts, what they're called formally, but it's really the dear so-and-so, send my love to so-and-so, the things you find in a letter. We begin to understand that Christianity emerges from a collective of persons working for the gospel. And I don't know about you, but at this moment, I find that good news a relief. No one person can save us from COVID-19. And in this moment where the absence of leadership at the top glares at us, we can feel hopeless about how we will be and emerge together from this crisis. And of course, leadership matters, policy matters, and individual work matters. But we are not going to be saved by any one person's ideas or actions or theology, not even Paul's. That's a little terrifying, but I really also find it comforting because I don't have to do it alone. And in fact, I can't do it alone. Our collective health is dependent on our collective action in this moment. The word for salvation, salvus in Latin, actually comes from a word that means overall well-being, including health. So it's not too much to say that our collective salvation at this moment is dependent on what we do together. And reading the letters of Paul as one part of a collective helps to teach us this. So, lesson number 4. Whose labor are we relying upon? Who are we missing? Who's overlooked? And here I'm going to read an excerpt from Philippians 2. I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon so that I may be cheered by news of you. I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. All of them are seeking their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But Timothy's worth you know, how like a son with a father he has served with me in the work of the gospel. I hope therefore to send him as soon as I see how things go with me, and I trust in the Lord that I will also come soon. Still, I think it necessary to send you Epaphroditus, my brother and co-worker and fellow soldier, more messenger and minister to my need, for he has been longing for all of you and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. He was indeed so ill that he nearly died, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. I'm the more eager to send him, therefore, in order that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. Welcome him then in the Lord with all joy and honor such people, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for those services that you could not give me. One of the benefits of reading all of Paul's letters, treating them as occasional letters, and looking at the people who are there beside Paul, is that we begin to ask new questions and notice new people. Like here, when we think about sending letters across long distances, we can think about Epaphroditus. Paul in Philippians, we find out, is in prison, and the Philippians have sent financial and spiritual support to Paul that is brought by Epaphroditus, who is likely also carried a letter from them to him. So in prison in antiquity, you were not provided with food or medicine or clothing. Others had to bring you what you needed. Many scholars think because of the way he's named here, that Epaphroditus might have been an enslaved person, carrying financial and spiritual support to Paul. Here we learned that Epaphroditus has become sick and almost died from doing this work. He's recovered, but now he's tasked with bringing this other letter, the letter to the Philippians, the one in your Bibles, back to them. This letter, with its beautiful Christ hymn and its imagery of abundance and unity and love, would not exist without the contribution and leadership of many persons who are largely overlooked, including here Epaphroditus, an enslaved person. This moment in Philippians teaches us to ask better questions about our present moment. We are often praying and cheering for healthcare workers, for doctors and nurses on the front lines in this moment, but there are others too upon whose labor we are reliant. Immigrants picking vegetables in California, folks in slaughterhouses in Iowa packed in tightly, janitors cleaning stores and bathrooms and hospitals with harsh chemicals and often too little protection, truck drivers who do not know where they can safely stop to use the restroom or sleep without risking their health. How can we better support and advocate for those who often take the most risks with the least compensation for humanity's collective survival? What can you be doing in your ministry context for these folks whose work is often overlooked? And last, lesson 5, living in the in-between times. So here I want to read a brief excerpt from 1 Thessalonians from chapters 2 and 3. As for us, brothers and sisters, when for a short time we were made orphans by being separated from you, in person, not in heart, we longed with great eagerness to see you face to face, for we wanted to come to you. Certainly I, Paul, wanted to again and again, but Satan blocked our way. For this reason, when I could bear it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith. I was afraid that somehow the tempter had tempted you and that our labor had been in vain. But Timothy has just now come to us from you and has brought us the good news of your faith and love. He has told us also that you always remember us kindly and long to see us, just as we long to see you. So for this last lesson, you might think I'm turning to 1 Thessalonians because of its frank dealings with themes of death and resurrection, addressing the anxiety of the Thessalonians about their beloveds who had died. But that's actually not the passage I wanted to look at with you. Instead, I wanted to point here to this glimpse again of what it means to actually write a letter. Here, Paul acknowledges that he really wants to see them in person. I'd rather be doing this talk face to face with all of you, but he can't right now. The distance has actually made him pretty nervous. What are those folks in Thessalonica doing without him? Are they okay? Did they go astray? He writes this letter to cross that distance and now confirms that he's received Timothy's good report. This is a little glimpse again that this scripture, with its profound theological reflections upon death and dying, is also a letter written by someone who really wishes he could be there in person. As we read this passage, I'd like us to return to thinking for a moment about the travel distance we talked about before, maybe that website you've been playing on for the last 20 minutes. We might rush over this passage because we're really used to instant access to one another, to hopping on a plane or a train or clicking a link on Zoom or FaceTime. But Paul, where he is writing from, is likely a month or more away from the Thessalonians at a minimum. Imagine that kind of waiting. You send Timothy with a letter to go check on your community because you're worried about them. But then you have to wait weeks, months, long months to hear. Timothy arrives back. You are relieved. You write back. The Thessalonians, on the other hand, are left waiting for Paul to come in person. They're waiting on Paul to come for weeks, for months. They don't see anything of him. And then suddenly Timothy comes. Not Paul, who they were waiting for, but Timothy. And then they send a message back to Paul through him. They must wait more weeks and more months and wait on more word. Maybe it's actually not so difficult now to get into that headspace of imagining the waiting. Many of us could not comprehend the length of waiting we would be doing when we first paused school or came home from work. I know for sure I have an office plant that is definitely dead right now. But we also have folks who drop off partners to give birth without them or send loved ones into hospitals, never knowing whether they will see them again face to face in this life. 1 Thessalonians helps us to remember that the earliest followers of Christ, too, knew what it was like to live in what I would call in-between times of waiting. Things happen while we have to wait. People are born, people die, people change, but we can also find meaning in these in-between times. The only way that the earliest Christ followers were able to stay connected was to live in the in-between times of travel and distance. And we too must live in the discomfort of in-betweenness if we're going to be able to communicate across the distance that COVID-19 has created. So I like to end all my presentations by giving you more reading if you're excited about these things. I always try to do that. So I'm going to end with 2 slides. One is a slide called Letters I Like. If you're interested in thinking about letters and what it means to kind of cross distance and find intimacy in absence, you should just be reading a variety of letters in this genre I just love. So I'd really recommend Martin Luther King Jr.'s Paul's Letter to American Christians. A lot of you've probably read the letter from a Birmingham jail, but I also really like this one, Paul's Letter to American Christians. Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I'm sorry, I misspelled it here, but Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, it's a memoir. It's actually written as a letter. It's written in letter form. James Baldwin's My Dungeon Shook, Letter to My Nephew from the Fire Next Time. It's a really great poem by Wilfred Owen, who's a World War I poet, called The Letter. Langston Hughes has a short poem called Letter, which if you look around a little bit on Google, you'll be able to find it somewhere. And then I really love this book. It's one of my favorites. It's called Women's Letters from Ancient Egypt, and it's edited by Roger Bagnall and Raffaella Carbiori. And what it is it's a collection of letters written by women in the ancient world, just everyday things like shopping lists and sending money, and also deeper things like loss. And it's really good to read alongside things that letters that you find in scripture, like the letters of Paul. And if you want to get like really academic about it, here's some books I'm recommending for stuff on the letters of Paul, especially related to some of the topics we talked about. And these are all published within the last 9 years or so they're all recent. There's a new volume called Bodies on the Verge, Queering Pauline Epistles that I really love. The chapter I noted in the quote is Beyond the Heroic Paul Toward a Feminist and Decolonizing Approach to the Letters of Paul. That whole volume is really great, The Colonized Apostle. The article I referenced is called Letters and Topography of Early Christianity. If you're interested in thinking more broadly about like everybody else in all these letters beside Paul, a really good example of that is an edited volume called The People Beside Paul, the Philippian Assembly and History from Below. If you want to read more about the travel stuff, Lorna Rale's book, Archaeology in the Letters of Paul, is just a treasure trove for that stuff. If you are interested in thinking about enslaved persons and their leadership in early Christianity, Catherine Shainer's book is the one to go to. And again, I cannot recommend enough Women's Letters from Ancient Egypt. Get it from your library. With that, thank you all so much. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see chat and also take your questions and stuff.
Well, thank you, Dr. Quigley. We're super grateful for your wonderful talk, for all the things that's inspired. And a lot of us I'm seeing in the chat that folks are wanting definitely the recording so that they can go back over this again in the future as well. So we really appreciate it. And I'll say you will probably get a follow-up email from us just thanking you for attending and letting you know about our next event. So maybe I can put some of the links to some of these books in there The longer the list got, the more I was trying to figure out if I could fit it in one email, but at least give you a handful on both of those two lists so that you have something to go to afterwards.
And I'm also happy to share my slides, which have hyperlinks to in some of them. So I can do that.
Yep, that was requested by some.
Okay.
So that's great and very generous of you. So this is the time where if you have questions, you can go ahead and put that in the chat. I would say go ahead and keep your mic muted just in order to make sure that the audio is coming through okay. What I will say is our very own Reverend Dr. Tanya Lynn Bennett is with us. We may not see her face right now, but I know that she's out there. And she mentioned that Paul's greeting, I give thanks every time I remember you, has been a phrase that she often uses to open pastoral care phone calls and has kind of been a source of inspiration in terms of her local ministry. And I know that, you know, part of your story is your UMC clergy. You also, for those that don't know, Dr. Quigley is a biblical scholar at Drew, but also teaches many of our chaplaincy courses. So if you came to Open Doors or have any connection here, you may have encountered her in that space. But I don't know, maybe you could just riff on that a little bit and give us a sense of how the letters have been a source of inspiration, either in your preaching or pastoral care or things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much. And actually, I will start by saying that my New Testament professor in seminary, I actually asked him to read, is deeply inspiring to me, James Walters at Boston University. And one of the reasons I went into biblical studies and just gave this really great lecture on 1 Corinthians 13 that I could not actually have it at my wedding without having him read it and riff on it a bit, because it's like so much more than all your just standard wedding stuff. But their wedding gift to me was a little cross stitch of Charis Humin Kai Irene. It's grace to you and peace. And that's a really standard greeting you have at the beginning of these letters of Paul. How you say hi to someone, you say grace to you and peace. And I think one of the benefits of reading expansively from the letters of Paul, reading all the boring parts and the names we can't pronounce and all that stuff, is we find these little kind of phrases of meaning that can be really useful. I think, like you were saying, Dr. Bennett, Dean Bennett, in prayer, in pastoral conversation, and I think are just really useful scriptures to go to beyond just kind of the normal stuff we turn to.
Sorry, I was muted there for a second.
Oh, yeah, I can actually show you. I got it here. I even got it's backwards, but the Greek here. That's our little cross stitch gift. That's why you should all take Greek, by the way.
That's biblical scholars' pitch to do more languages. I don't know. I thought I snuck out without it, but we'll see. All right, so who else has a question that they want to ask? You can either unmute yourself in the bottom left corner if you want, or you can enter it into the chat. Just if you do go ahead and unmute yourself, make sure to click that back on when we're finished so we don't have too much feedback. But here, I'll put my gallery view on so I can hear from folks. I want to jump in.
Dr. Quigley, this is Ryan. Wonderful presentation, thank you. I noticed you stuck to the undisputed letters of Paul in your presentation. Are there any of the other Pauline letters that somewhat connect to this era of COVID-19 that we're living in? Anything? And that's kind of a random question, but wondering if there's other letters that you think have some content or context that would be relevant.
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and I always recommend to folks who are interested in letters that may or may not have been written by Paul, but are written from Paul, to look at a chapter called Out of Love for Paul by Lauren Israel. I can't remember the volume, but I can look it up and add it to the bibliography. I like to reframe how we think letters that might not actually have been written by the person Paul in the mid-first century, but are probably written by people who care a lot about Paul and are trying to emulate him by writing as him to their communities and their moments. I try to think about that expansively as not something that's kind of like forgery or a bad thing. If you copy your papers today, you'd get in trouble with your dean. But as part of a broader way of writing in the ancient world, that one of the best ways you can honor someone is to write as them. And one of the best ways to have a powerful message is to write as someone with authority. And that's actually one of the reasons that King Paul's letter to American Christians is really interesting, because King frames it as this whole conversation as, I, Martin Luther King Jr., have just discovered this lost letter from Paul to the people in America. And look, I'm going to read it now. And it just makes the message kind of extra profound. King's not, messing around with people. He's not trying to lie to them, but he's trying to add weight to the message that he has. Thanks for getting the proper citation there, Soren. Thanks, I appreciate it. So I do think texts basically anything. I think the prison correspondence is really important here. So I think Colossians is a good place to look as well, because I think the particular situation of writing, so like Philemon, Philippians, and Colossians are just really good places to look, because when you're writing when Paul is writing from prison, he's writing from a place where absence is not by choice. Right? A lot of times in writing, Paul says he wants to be there. And like, if he really had the money and really had to, and like a giant emergency happened, he might be able to cobble together enough and go over and get there. And that's in fact what we seem to be waffling about in the Corinthian correspondence. But when Paul's in jail for the gospel, he really is restricted in where he can go and what he can do. And I think that moment speaks to the kind of extra heightened emotion you get from that, and the kind of way you think differently about what it means to communicate across difference looks different when the way you're writing as though you're writing from a place where you do not have freedom of movement. Great question.
Who else has a question that they want to ask? We'll probably maybe take one more, depending on the time. We can maybe do two, but we want to keep it to the hour as we promised. So feel free to jump in if you have a question. Well, if folks are not, I might just, did someone?
Hello, I have a question.
Yeah.
Right, I'm joining you from Africa, from Africa University, Zimbabwe.
Great.
Hi, welcome.
Yes. My question to the presenter, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I am glad that I joined this meeting and I'm inspired by your presentation. However, I have questions, particularly in Africa. The effect of COVID-19 pandemic is very real. There are many people that are passing through two different challenges. The first challenge is the issue of the lockdown, which the government imposed on many people. Some people who probably, even when the businesses were in operation, they were having challenge of how to acquire food. And now they cannot go out to look for food, and government are not providing anything for them. Now, as a pastor, in this context, which letter of Paul will you recommend for me to use in order to minister to people? Thank you.
That's a great question. Thank you so much for joining us across the time zone difference that you are doing right now, and for your work in ministry there, and for your educational work at Africa University. I really recommend the letter to the Philippians and that volume, The People Beside Paul. In Philippians 4, Paul says that he knows the secret of being hungry. He knows what it is to have lack, and he knows what it is to have abundance. And so I think, and also the letter to the Philippians are probably the folks of the communities of Paul that have the least resources. But guess who Paul writes to when he's in prison for help? When Paul needs food, needs support, and the government's not going to feed him while he's in jail. He writes to those folks because he knows that that collective in Philippi is able to care for one another and to share their resources, even though they don't have a lot, because the government's not going to come in and save them. But that in this moment of extreme hardship, he turns to the community that knows hardship the most because he knows they know how to care for one another. And so I find Philippians, and you'll actually find in Paul uses the Philippian communities to kind of shame the Corinthian communities and the Corinthian correspondence for not giving enough when he's trying to take up collections for people who are in need. He says, oh, look at those folks in Macedonia, those folks in Philippi. They don't have a lot, and they manage to take care of one another and to find alternatives and to find collectives when there are all these crises going on. And so I think the example of not just Paul writing to the Philippians, but the example of the Philippian communities and the way that they are taking care of one another and finding a way to make the little that they have go around to take care of people through crisis and to take care of Paul through crisis. Paul's in jail, and they're able to take care of him in that moment. I think really speaks to some of the value that you can have when you turn to folks who have experienced hardship and ask them what their theology learned from real experience is. So I would really recommend that letter to you, and if you can get access to it at your library, that volume from Joseph Marshall there.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
I think Leo's waving. Do we have time for one more?
Yeah. Let's do one more.
Yeah, just real quick. Of course, Dr. Quigley, I'm going to ask you for the conservative thought when you do the bibliography.
Yeah.
Of course, okay. Also, too, I was interested because I also had, when I did this class with you, I had the letter from Martin Luther King to America, and I didn't see a link necessarily to just that letter.
Yeah.
It'd be great to, I know I don't have the letter now because I took a class over you.
Yeah.
Last year. So I'd love to be able to get that again. That would be gorgeous.
Great. I will.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah. So again, I think that I have a range of resources there, and that Joseph Marshall letter book is, I think, that second one, The People Beside Paul. I think it actually works whether your theology is conservative, progressive, or moderate. I think this reorientation to the whole communities of early Christ followers and not just relying upon a singular genius Paul works for all theologies. You don't need to be conservative, progressive, moderate. I think that reorientation works for people of all theological orientations and gets everybody asking new and interesting questions that I think are really worth thinking about. The other resource I would recommend, if you're interested more in this topic of kind of poverty and care for one another, there's a really important article, Poverty in Pauline Studies by Steve Friesen. It's pretty kind of seminal in the field. That gives you a really good sense of what the actual state of on the ground is, that probably at least 90% of persons in antiquity are living at or below subsistence level, right? At or below subsistence level. And so again, I think resources like that give you some sense of historical context, that this is the reality folks are living in, are really helpful for people who are needing to preach and teach and do theology and do ministry right now, no matter what your theological persuasion is. And thanks so much again. Lauren's like grabbing all my resource for you. But yeah, the King Institute website there. So, but before you all log off, make sure you copy your links because the chat disappears. I've learned that the hard way. So copy those into your browser if you need them.
Yeah, and I can leave things up. I'll mute my screen at the end, but I can leave things up for a few minutes so folks can make sure they copy and paste stuff and don't get frozen out with those resources. So great. Well, I think that is probably our last question. I'm going to feel really guilty if someone's like waving at me to make sure I don't do this, but I think we're good. It looks like we got most people that had a question. And like last time, Dr. Keller offered that if we had, there were some folks who still had questions left. If If you want to shoot an email to the email where you received the link from, I would be happy to send those on to Dr. Quigley, and I'm sure could get a short little response of maybe not lecture length, but a little one of some thoughts on whatever question is kind of sticking with you. Well, thank you, Dr. Quigley, so much for joining us tonight. Can we give, even if you're muted, a little round of applause to our presenter?
Thank you all so much.